Welcome, and I'm really excited that you're all able to join today. Very excited to have our panelists here, sort of ranging throughout the region. So I thought to get this talk started, we'd go from oh and okay, Al, good call. Give a plug for the Maine Heritage Orchard calendar. We made another calendar for the Maine Heritage Orchard at MOFGA, and this year William Mullen, who some of you may know as the Palm Queen on social media, has provided photographs for us. So we have a bunch of really fun photos of some heirloom apples and maybe a couple of other surprises in there. And our friend Cecilia Zico has put that together for us and arranged for printing to take place here in Maine. So you can purchase that on MOFGA's store. I believe that's store.mofga.org. There's also a link from the Heritage Orchard website. And Sean has a Black Oxford. Maybe that will be featured in the calendar. Thanks, Sean. So those are $20 there. If you had a calendar from the Heritage Orchard last year, these are larger calendars, so you'll have space to like write in your dentist appointment or whatever if you were missing that last year. So yes, please support MOFGA in any way you can, and all of our fruit explorers. So many good efforts from this crowd. But I think we'll jump right in and get started with Eliza. And so if each of you, if you want to tell us like a bit about yourselves, what you've been up to, and what you're particularly excited about this season.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Eliza Greenman, and I guess I primarily define myself as a fruit explorer these days, and then I grow fruits and things. But I live in Virginia. I live in Northern Virginia, and my fruit exploring realm is mostly like probably the mid-Atlantic states and then into the deep South. And part of the reason is because I live here. The other part is because I'm in one of the most inhospitable climates known to temperate fruits. And so it's really important for me to constantly search the landscape and try and find something that might be naturally resistant or highly tolerant to many of the diseases that orchardists face, because I'm just not going to settle for spraying chemicals. And so I started off as an apple person, and I cut my teeth in Maine, and John Bunker got me started fruit exploring apples in Maine. But soon thereafter, when I headed back south, there just weren't as many old apple trees in the deep South. And there also, that territory had largely been covered, like Lee Calhoun, Tom Burford, Tom Brown. I mean, there were a lot of players active in the apple scene, and I was really excited to join in. But we have crazy vines that like New England is starting to get in the form of invasive like Oriental bittersweets and things. But you know, we're like the OGs in like grapevines and everything else that grows, poison ivy that grows and eventually just like causes trees to collapse if not maintained. And so because of that, I always have an eye out for apples, and mostly I have an eye out for cider apples and apples that have a unusual growing window, like ones that are dropping in mid-June or something like that. And those are for livestock. But I've largely transitioned into some other fruits, mostly mulberry at this point, because mulberry are really long-lived. They're super resilient. Like they've been cultivated for thousands of years to withstand like heavy pruning. And so what's not a heavy pruning, but like a vine trying to take you down to the ground. And also just culturally speaking, like they were brought over by King James 400 years ago. They hybridized with our natives. They were brought over again for the silk trade in the 1800s, where they hybridized again with their natives. So there's a really cool intersection with mulberries these days, where Morus alba, the Asian mulberry, and Morus rubra, our native mulberry, come together and they can form ever-bearing mulberries. So you can get, in my climate, 3 or more months of drop. a fruit drop, and of heavy fruit drop at that, or you get extremely high protein levels in leaves that can feed animals and are designed to be cut over and over again within the season. So yeah, I do a lot of mulberry. I do a lot of nut trees also. I tend to stick towards old Quaker areas for looking for old nut trees, because the Quakers are the originals really in grafting most of the nut trees in North America for outside of the deep South, where enslaved people were grafting like pecans and things. But a lot in my area were Quakers and throughout the East Coast. And so yeah, that's a quick, I guess, introduction to what I'm into.
Awesome. Thanks, Eliza. All right, William, you're next up the coast.
Hi, I'm William. I'm an artist and a photographer based in Brooklyn. My primary fruit exploring range is the city. A lot of people's front yards, and sometimes backyards, but also fruit that's on the outside of city parks, on the side of city highways. So like Bay Ridge, BQE, West Side Highway in Manhattan. I think I just saw one tree once in Brooklyn, and then my eyes just became kind of fixed to finding orbs in trees. And I've just been finding a lot of apples throughout the city, with a lot of help from Dan Pucci, who has tipped me off to many apple trees across Brooklyn. A lot of these trees are cultivated, so they've definitely been grafted and they're in someone's front yard or backyard. But I've definitely found some seedling trees in the city as well, especially alongside the highways. Some that are not so bad, but most that are not particularly interesting, but sort of just fun to see. Yeah. Should I talk about? I think this is mostly about fruit exploring, so that's the extent of my fruit exploring experience.
But you could talk about how your fruit exploring extends into the rest of your life.
Yeah. It often gets me into trouble. Yeah. I guess. How to sense the rest of my life? Well, I explore fruit in other people's orchards, and I have a photo project called Odd Apples that I primarily post through Instagram on my account, Palm Queen. And I'm working on a second book with my friend Andrea, who does design and layout. That will be out sometime next year. I did say this year earlier, but it will be next year. And recently featured in the MOFGA calendar, which I'm super stoked about. Yeah. I guess I'm just really fascinated by fruit expression and resiliency of fruit. None of the apples that I find in Brooklyn are particularly good. There's a couple cultivated ones that are tasty, or grafted, I think, more appropriately. But I think it's just it's always fun to show people where they are and still pick them and taste them. It kind of brings about a sense of wonder that this tree grows under the Veronzo Narrows Bridge, and just trying to think of who or what dropped the seeds there that grew that tree, how many years ago. The fact that it survived probably has a lot of diesel in it or something like that, heavy metals or whatever. But it's just kind of I kind of have a low key obsession with patches in sidewalks that grow random flowers, like Queen Anne's lace growing out of a crack in the sidewalk, which I feel happens a lot in Brooklyn. And I just find that really incredible that like despite, you know, the land generally being paved over in the New York City metro area, you know, everything from, you know, a flower to a fruit tree has managed to find space to grow and fight for that sunlight and that soil. Yeah, I spend a lot of my time walking around, just like checking on these trees. Um, I recently checked on a free persimmon tree that has been picked too early. I'm not happy about it. Whoever did that, but whatever. So yeah, that's kind of my long-winded fruit exploring background.
Awesome. Thanks, William. Okay, Matt, you're up next.
Hey everybody, my name is Matt Kaminsky. I'm tuning in from Hadley, Massachusetts, where I live and farm. I work at Carr's Cider House, which some of you may be familiar with. Carr's Cider House is based at Preservation Orchard, which is the new name that we are calling sort of our collective farming project. And so there we grow a lot of apples and some mixed tree nuts, getting more into that sort of thing as we go. So that is a new area of learning for me, but I would say that my foremost interest in fruit exploring is with pomes, apples and pears specifically, but I've spent a lot of my time dealing with apples. And yeah, I guess my real interest over the past 5 or 6 years has been to sort of get a little pomage together of some varieties, a small catalog of varieties of seedlings that I've sort of tracked around the New England region more broadly, that seem, for me and my purposes, what I'm interested in as both fruit and as trees, to be really exceptional seedlings that show some promise. And that's been an ongoing journey of learning in terms of assessing these sorts of things and getting them to be propagated a little bit among my own efforts, and then the efforts of other growers regionally have been really helpful in sort of expanding that that whole project, which is going to be a long-term thing that continues. This year, I guess, I mean, I want to talk for a second, I guess, just mention a little bit of what I've been interested in this year, what's been like the big takeaway, since this is like an annual Great Maine Apple Day event kind of thing. It seems germane to talk about what 2020 has been like. And it's been kind of strange because I cover a lot of territory in terms of where I go looking for apples, and then where I sort of have relationships with people who are involved in foraging and growing. And it's like 2020 has been crazy for people. It's a lot of trees in a lot of different places where there is a history of apple cultivation of just like totally froze out in the spring. And a lot of folks have very small crops this year, or no crops at all due to late spring freezes. And so that does sum up a little bit of what I'm interested in right now, in terms of the apples and pears that I think are really valuable for us in this sort of climate change world that we are centered in. We look for late bloomers and things that are in other ways sort of hardy to our post-climate apocalypse scenarios that are becoming more and more real with each sort of growing season that we traverse. And this year in particular, I've been looking around in more trying to track what areas that I'm exploring seem to have big stores of fruit, and then what kind of environmental factors unify that. Those types of sites, and contrast that with like, all right, why are the other, reliable wild apple foraging areas not really doing so well, whether it's a simple answer about, late freezing and poor siting and this sort of thing, but just sort of looking more broadly at what environmental factors figure into super abundant, prolific, happy populations of wild tree fruit, and what kind of environmental factors don't seem to be so influential with that. So I've been messing around with that, and two particular things that have been interesting this year is that, at least in Western Mass where I am, I've been finding a lot of trees in like river valleys, some of the smaller rivers that are tributaries into the Connecticut River, which is the big river around here, seem to just be like loaded with fruit, whereas some of the upland areas that we look more reliably in for finding interesting wild specimens seem to be like devoid this year. And so I've been just ruminating on that a lot, and that's been interesting. And a project that seems to sort of keep on going is this Heath, Massachusetts cultural project, where if some of you have been to Western Mass, you might have found your way to Heath, which is like probably the most isolated community in the state. And there's a serious history of good cider making in that area, and a lot of it focuses on grafting Baldwin seems to have been a big deal there, but there are some local, what I suspect are local varieties there that I'm really just super, I don't know, interested in learning more about. Because this year I have one with me, but we have this like really big green oblate thing. It's very quite heavy with some red blushing. And this is a variety that I've found one really old tree and a couple other trees that I suspect were grafted. And the locals around here call it, or in Heath, they call it Dickinson greening after an old farmer who had this sort of like impressive orchard at his farm. And so one fruit exploring and then cultural conservation effort has been to try and learn more about that, because Dickinson has since died, and a fancy famous like iron sculptor from New York City bought his farm and doesn't do much to keep any of the history going. So that's been an ongoing project that I'm trying to put more effort into this year, because the trees are in horrible shape and we're really hoping to get some info on it before they die. And Heath itself is like a town whose population totally dwindling. So seems like there's a lot of history that could be lost there in terms of just pomological efforts that have been expended by a lot of cool orchard people over the years. So that's sort of what I've been up to this year, in addition to collaborating with William, Mr. Palm Queen, on this book here, our Proceedings, which is not so much an effort of mine and his as the effort of fruit explorers across the North American scene. A lot of people submitted their favorite wild apples and pears to us to put on an event last year in November around this time that just sort of showcased all of the, sort of favorite specimens of wild apples and pears that were in fruit last year, and sort of cataloged them. It's a compendium, photographic compendium with some pomological profiles of 69 of the latest and greatest on the scene from all over. So it's a fun project that we intend to continue in future years. And that is what we've been up to, what I've been up to, and involving some other friends on here. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so much good stuff. I would highly suggest checking out the pomological exhibition book if you have not seen that yet. gnarlypippins.com, right, Matt? Yeah, that's where you can find that book. And next, I think that Sean is slightly more south in Maine than Aaron, so we'll do Sean. And then
Okay. Yeah, I know that's a funny way to consider everyone. So my name's Sean. Hello everyone. I do a fair amount of foraging in southern Maine, mostly for two cider makers, Jared Carr out in Cornish cider in Cornish, Maine, and then David Buchanan for Portersfield cider in Pownell, Maine. And most of my apple work, though, with this, going back to what Matt said about kind of reflecting on the year, this is actually the year where I've been able to dedicate the most time to foraging for cider fruit, because usually my wife and I put on an apple tasting in Portland every year, and that kind of consumes about a month of driving around to orchards across New England. And so something that's been weird about the pandemic is actually having time to invest a little bit more in finding stuff. Like Matt said, it's been a weird year up here as well in terms of late freezes and what's actually kind of bearing fruit. But an exciting one nonetheless. And beyond that work, foraging for those two cider makers, I try to get the apples that I find into some use. So something locally that I've been part of is a local cider bar called the Noche, which opened this year, recently in Portland, has put on what's called a backyard cider project. So they've worked with basically trying to get the community to contribute fruit for cider making, and to increase visibility about the usefulness of seedling fruit and grafted varieties too that people have neglected, and trying to put them to use. And part of that's been really interesting because it's involved a lot of trying to teach people a bit about what they're looking for if they're looking for cider fruit in the wild. Because I think that tends to be a barrier to entry, is not even really knowing what you want to find. And then also contributing fruit to that and trying to get people in touch with them. So it's been a strange year by far, but it's also been a relatively good foraging year. And it's been interesting to see in that space it's been made available what projects and other things have come about that otherwise might not happen. When I'm not foraging with apple stuff, I'm mostly documenting fruit, like William, but in a slightly different context, on Instagram called The Righteous Russet, which is really about trying to create somewhat of an encyclopedia. I mean, as much as that, it's not really possible, but let's say, I like the word compendium. Compendium's a good word that Matt used, of varieties that are currently grown in the United States, and providing a visual resource for people, which I hope would be helpful in terms of fruit exploring, in terms of providing a resource where you can at least, I try to identify, not definitively identify, but hopefully rule out some possibilities when you're looking for fruit out in the hinterlands, or like William in New York City. And so eventually I hope that becomes comprehensive enough that it's useful in that way.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. Aaron, what are you up to?
Hi, I'm Aaron Parker. I am a fruit explorer and nurseryman. So the nursery is something that was kind of a sideline for the last 5 or so years, and this is my first year really doing nursery stuff full time. So that's been a nice change of pace. And unlike everyone else, I am really not that interested in apples. So I tend to be more excited about really unusual stuff. And I'm gonna see if I can switch to my front camera here. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is the fruit that has been most exciting this year. This is a pawpaw, or a bunch of pawpaws. This is maybe a third to half of the production of my best bearing pawpaw tree this year. And then here's an example of a American persimmon, which this tree is absolutely loaded this year, but they're not quite ripe yet. And with both pawpaw and persimmon in Maine, it's kind of, you never know whether they're all going to ripen in any given year. But this being a very hot year, I think the chances are excellent. I'm also increasingly interested in nut trees, especially some of the less familiar ones. So here are a bunch of red oak acorns, which I've been processing a lot of the last few years, and I think are a really underutilized nut trees, especially since they're so common in the landscape. So that's something I want to explore more, and think about propagating, the most desirable genetics that are around. And then one that I don't have an example of is yellowhorn, or Xanthoceras sorbifolium. Yeah, my fruit exploring ranges from kind of around southern Maine, as well as I'm really a huge fan of the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. So if you want to fruit explore some of the more unusual species, that's a really amazing place to go and check out some really wild fruit trees and other unusual plants. Yeah, so that's, I guess a couple of things that I haven't seen fruit from, but I'm excited about this year are Japanese raisin tree, Hovinia dulcis, which I've failed to get germination on several times, and this year I got about 100 seedlings. So hopefully they survive in this climate. And then several species of Xanthoxylum, which you might be more familiar with as Szechuan pepper, which is a spice that grows on a tree that may or may not produce in this climate, but seems to do well in Massachusetts. So here's hoping they can make it in Maine. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Very cool. Thanks, Aaron. I have never heard of the Japanese raisin and did not know that you could potentially grow Szechuan here. That's pretty exciting. All right, and Jesse, let's hear from you.
Hey folks, I have a orchard and nursery in Western Maine, about an hour from the coast, in a zone 4 location at about 1,000 feet of elevation. And initially my focus was heirloom apples, and that's kind of what got me into it. And then I just started glomming onto all kinds of different fruit and nut species. Assembling what essentially is a trial orchard. I now have well over 1,000 different varieties of different kinds of woody fruiting species of plants at my place, and have been kind of screening them in a low intensive sort of food forest kind of atmosphere at my place, just to see what grows well in a low intervention kind of backyard environment. I like to drive around and look for trees, just like the rest of us, I suppose. And I cover ground mostly in Western and Central Maine. Some projects this past year related to fruit exploring that have been exciting during the season, harvest season. I've been getting into historic Maine pears through colleagues Laura and Lauren Cormier. There are a number of old pear trees that are remnants of backyard plantings and even commercial orchards that have been collecting fruit samples from this past year and trying to nail down their identity. So that's been a lot of fun, and just learning more about getting original documents, looking at those source materials, as was covered in the last talk, so important. And then another area that I've been getting into has been nut trees. So, and these are mostly all, of course, seedlings that we can find around Maine. And so chestnuts and different sorts of walnuts have been things that I've been driving around and looking for and collecting seed for propagating in my nursery. Additionally, I kind of get into some of the weird stuff like Aaron. So I have planted some zone pushing sort of plants. Like I said, my spot up in the foothills of the White Mountains is zone 4, so it gets down below -20 often. But yet I've perhaps optimistically planted a bunch of more temperate climate species there, just to see, is it possible to grow figs, for example, in Maine? And what do you know, it is. So there's room to explore even without really setting foot from your backyard, I find, by trying new stuff. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. So we have a bunch of time left, and my hope is that there are other people on this call who might want to share with us what you're up to, or also to ask each other questions, to presenters or otherwise. And the questions can be from participants or presenters. And you feel free to use the chat or to unmute, or if you really feel like you should be formal, you could raise your hand. And if anybody else, Eliza, I'll take you up on that. I mean, there's so much knowledge in this group. So if anybody just has more to share about, or more questions for people, have at it.
I'll start. So
Please do. Thanks, Liza.
Sean just wrote in the chat box for asking me to tell everybody about my invention. So as part of fruit exploring, like a lot of times we're dealing with larger trees. Very rarely are we dealing with dwarf trees. Maybe William is dealing with more dwarfing trees that are sort of like urban dwarfed or something. But yeah, so the issue, and so we say you find a winner, like for example, this year, maybe a few weeks ago, I was in Eastern Ohio and touring somebody's orchard, and up on the hill was this wild apple tree. And I was like, oh, let's go check that out. There was a couple apples on it, and it was like the best apple I've had, I don't know, in a couple years. Like amazing. It had 23 bricks. It was addicting. It had amazing biting flesh, like just crisp, everything that you would want, super balanced. And so like with a tree like that, you're thinking, I gotta come back next year and harvest these apples. Like this thing is crazy. And so what I have done is I originally imported an olive harvester from Spain, and have made some improvements to it. I'm still making more improvements, but it's basically a net that's like an upside down umbrella that you push to the trunk of the tree. It wraps around it and provides you with a 21 feet in diameter, basically upside down catch umbrella. And so either you crawl in the tree, and it's a two-person thing. Either you get in the tree and you have them like seal you up and you shake all the fruit off, or you figure out a way to shake it mechanically. And so that's allowing me to turn fruit exploring more so into a commercial endeavor, where like if you're that's the whole thing. Like people plant dwarf apples for ease of harvest half the time, also ease of pruning. But if you can pull up to a place that maybe has like 4 or 5 trees that are like worth your time, and you move this we're calling it crop catch. You move this thing underneath the tree, and it's catching, I don't know, 2 bushels every 5 minutes that you're shaking. It's way worth your time, and I can turn around and sell that fruit instantly. That's not a problem. So yeah, that's what's going on. We're making some improvements to it this year, probably late winter-ish, and then hopefully, and also getting like some machinery specs done, but hopefully we'll be offering them for sale soon, like next year, because everybody needs it. If you're going to fruit explore and you want to try and harvest, get a cash crop off of these trees you're finding, this is the way to go about it. So.
Yes, everyone does need one of those. Tarps are the worst. They're so annoying. That's, yeah, pretty amazing. You should, if you have not seen what Eliza's talking about, there is a post on her Instagram recently about this upside down umbrella tree fruit shaker harvester.
I wonder if I could screen share it. I have it on my computer.
Oh, yeah, I bet you could. I'll make sure that participants can share screen. Let's see. Is that something I'm allowed to do? Well, let me know if you cannot do it, Eliza, and I'll figure that out. But we do have some questions sort of emerging in the chat. And Cameron Peace is wondering, when hunting for seedlings that could be useful for cider, what attributes are you looking for in their fruit? And he also noted that free is obviously one of those. Sean or Matt, others, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I could start. I mean, so I guess with the people I work for, so Jared uses almost exclusively wild fruit, some stuff that he's brought into an orchard setting and is hoping to grow. David uses a backbone of some American varieties. And I think, honestly, what I'm almost always looking for is not acid. I just feel like, I guess I assume when I'm looking for fruit that by the nature of producers needing enough fruit to produce enough of a batch, that there's going to end up being acid in whatever they create, and in the fruit that they have to use. So I try to really focus in on things that would be on the bittersweet side of the equation, and something that is also juicy. I think what's also hard though, and I'm sure other people can speak to this, is you find something that you think qualifies into that area, but you're not necessarily sure if it's totally ripe yet and it's expressing itself fully. So it's definitely a multi-year endeavor, but I would definitely say I'm almost only looking for things that are bitter and sweet, or just even sweet, because I think acid is, and this is also just personal preference, is kind of the bane of a lot of ciders. And I will try to find stuff that could actually provide a backbone or a counterbalance to that.
Thanks, Sean. Matt, you want to jump in there? I know you really love some bitter sharps.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, I mean, it really depends obviously on what types of ciders are going to be made, what the preferences and the sort of the culture of cider in both the cider house that you're working with and then the clientele that is going to be consuming that cider eventually is all interested in. I know at least as a, if you look at what I forage as a case study, I'm like really interested in acidity from wild apples, because I find that a lot of the sharps that are being grown for cider making, a really popular one, at least in our part of New England, sort of Western New England, for sort of large scale cider growing sharps. People use Gold Rush a lot, and it just drives me up a wall, because I think that Gold Rush is like the wimpiest. Like, if you can eat a whole apple of this particular variety that you're getting your sharp content from in the cider, then I'm just not interested. I think that a proper sharp should be like totally insane acid, but not, that also gets at the point that really when you taste a lot of wild apples, there's a whole spectrum of different quality acidity, and within that there are like types of acid that I really don't like, and then types that I really do like. So we're always looking for a novel type of acidity. I like sort of a savory acidity rather than the sort of pixie stick candy-like acidity. And so I've got my deerskin russet here, which is like my favorite sharp. It's like a big producer this year, and just has it's like almost salty, I swear, but it's just a very substantive kind of acid. And I'm really interested in foraging that rather than the bittersweets, because we grow Dabinet and we grow White Jersey, and we're not like looking for that, because that's the backbone, and we want to be adding in more of a zing. That's what the Yankee cider drinkers around here tend to enjoy. So, but it's different everywhere you go.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. We have another question about pawpaw seeds, growing them from seed. Do they come true to type? Aaron, go ahead.
So they don't come exactly true to type. Kind of more along the lines of if you're familiar with growing stone fruit from seed. But the gist of it is I think it's definitely worth growing pawpaws from seed rather than grafting. especially if you're in Maine or anywhere else near the northern limit of pawpaw cultivation. Especially, and that's because the seedlings tend to be a lot tougher as far as winter hardiness. That graft union, especially on young trees, can be really vulnerable to freeze damage. So what I generally recommend for people wanting to try pawpaws in the north is to plant seedlings of early season cultivars, with PA Golden being a really well proven seed parent. And if you're interested in growing pawpaws from seed, they do take a little bit of special handling. They're recalcitrant seeds, so they don't want to dry out. So you want to take them from ripe fruit and put them basically straight into stratification. So keep them cool and damp in a refrigerator or in a root cellar. And they need about 100 days of stratification. And then you can either start them inside or you can keep them cool until spring and then plant them. And then they take a really long time to come up. I plant pawpaw seeds basically every year, and they usually don't break the surface until like end of June or even early July. And that's because they're really taproot dominant. So by the time the seedling breaks the surface, it's got about 12 inches of taproot. So you want to take that into consideration as well and plant them in really damp or really deep pots, or potentially directly in the spot where you want them to grow.
Interesting. Thank you, Aaron. And we have a little discussion going on in the chat about apple trees growing in very close proximity to the ocean or the coast. Sean, you're right there in Portland. What have you found about? Have you noticed any apples growing by the ocean?
Oh yeah, totally. No, apples, I mean, considering that when they hang over towards the ocean, they usually have pretty unobstructed light. We have a bunch in Portland, even along the Eastern Prom. You could definitely put together an Eastern Prom blend. I'll get Matt up here because they're mostly acidic, so he'll probably be just like jumping up in joy. But no, substantial. It's kind of strange because you'll go from a coastal zone where you see a lot of apple trees along the coast, and then sometimes hit kind of a barren patch until you kind of get out a little bit farther. So it's kind of it's funny how happy they are. And I think it's kind of curious. And that's also true from what I've gathered on a lot of Maine islands, is they're also just loaded with trees that are right along the coast and like the rocky exteriors. To what Todd was saying in the chat, I mean, I guess I almost just generally assume that those end up being seedlings. I don't know who would purposely plant apple trees right next to the ocean. I mean, more power to people if they want to. That sounds awesome. So it tends to be ripe for fruit exploring and just trying to get novel genetic material, just because you got a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah, we've definitely harvested from some seaside rogue seedlings, and some of the cider we've made from that has had a little bit of that saline quality too, which is I don't know, was cool to me feature of a cider. But and Sean, to your point about the seedlings, I have seen there's one tree in Harpswell that is, I think, a winter Harvey that is like hanging over the edge of the bank towards the water there. I think Jacob went there and collected cyanwood with me last year, 2 years ago. So there are a few trees. I don't know who's planting them right there on the coast, or if the land is sort of getting eaten away by the water, but those trees are out there for sure.
Laura, can I jump in and ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So Laura and I have been talking a little bit about whether the Maine Heritage Orchard could serve as do something like this maybe 4 times a year, where fruit explorers could talk together, at least for now, virtually. As one of the things, now that we have the orchard established, one of the things we're really trying to think about is how to strengthen fruit exploring generally, just how to support people doing the work and build networks and that sort of stuff. And I was just curious to hear whether folks would find it helpful to have some kind of conversation space, not like a chat or something like that, but a conversation space like this that around fruit exploring.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be great because like every now and then I'll inundate somebody on this list. I think maybe the most recent one was Aaron and they get like the full brunt of pent up fruit exploring, which lasts like an hour and a half of just constant stream excitement. And so it would be great to have a quarterly outlet.
Cool. Maybe that's something we'll keep going, the forum. And maybe even post-pandemic, it's nice to be able to connect with people over a wide range. Eliza, I'm curious to hear more about how your hogs and your silvopasture efforts are going these days.
Sure. So I guess we can transition a little bit into silvopasture, and I want to hear Matt too, because he's in a different animal league than I am. But yeah, so my hog silvopasture is going. Basically right now, like I'm at the point where it's very important for me to capture all of these genetics, to find and capture all these genetics and basically have them in a repository first. That's in a safe location. And so just 2 days ago, it's a handshake deal, but a lawyer was present that I think just landed a repository space for a 50-acre repository space for all of this. And so that's, what I'm really interested in when it comes to silvopasture is like extending the season for animals to either supplement what you're feeding the animals or to completely take it over. And so for me, like mulberries are that early season that can go into midsummer. Apples and pears pick up in mid-June. They go through the rest of the year. I've got chinkapin chestnuts that pick up in August and go through November. Persimmons that pick up in September and go through January, and then like pecans that go from say October through March in my climate, depending on what we're. And so those are like the lenses that I look for when we're wandering through the landscape. Is holy shit! Oops, excuse me. I'm sorry. It's but like it's March 3rd, and this tree is still half full of pecans that only started to drop. Kind of thing. And there's like 40 bushels of pecans in that tree. Like that's what's really important to me. And so I produce charcuterie right now off of my hogs that are raised in this way, where they're getting like most of the fruit, like basically fruit explored fruit that are coming from these places. But for right now, a lot of my effort is going into retaining that germplasm and getting it safe, so that then we can start to plot out landscapes in like really practical ways of creating orchards that support flow of people and feeding of livestock. And it's really exciting. It's like an uncharted territory sort of in this country. And there's so much to learn about even just our native trees that don't produce fruit, but we can harvest the leaves and things like that. So it's a whole new learning process for me, especially since and this is like the only way I coordinate with my extension service is that they will process these samples for me and break them down nutritionally. Otherwise, I don't use extension for any sort of fruit exploring. So there you go.
Cool. Amazing. I'm always a little enviable of your climate down there that you can have year-round tree crops coming down. Incredible. Well, Matt, you're up here a little closer to Maine, and maybe in a similar climate to most people on the call, and also working with different animals. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you and Rachel have been up to the last few years?
Yeah, sure. I will just preface this brief blurb about silvopasture in Hadley with that, our fruit exploring efforts, I don't really think that impacts our livestock work quite as much, but more our orchard management practices and sort of approach to that, and how that might relate a little more to the types of apple trees that you're likely to find out in the great beyond. There's similarities there, but where the fruit varieties and the genetics of the trees that we're planting doesn't so much, our silvopasture doesn't hinge so much on that like Eliza's. So I think what Eliza's doing is like truly integrating these two realms of like fruit exploring with silvopasture and livestock husbandry, which is just like the gnarliest thing. But what Rachel and I are doing is sort of like a classical approach to like cider apple silvopasture using sheep. That's sort of just being modified by the types of like trees that we're planting, which for the most part is full size trees planted, at pretty wide spacings that are grafted very high, almost like the French, like haute tige or like high headed kinds of trees. We're planting a lot of those using varieties, doing the nursery work and grafting varieties that I've found out in the wild around that are really promising. So we're sort of doing a novel apple high-headed silvopasture just for cider. But this year what's cool is that a lot of the people on here I know are really interested in cider, and this year we're sort of working the sheep both through those new blocks that are really laid out for a silvopasture framework, but also trying to squeeze the herd of sheep through these like G30, Geneva 30 dwarf blocks, and just use grazing power instead of mowing power, which in a lot of ways simulates the type of understory management that you would expect in a wild apple situation, where a lot of grazing animals like deer and moose are prominent, and that will undoubtedly have some effect on the yeast of going into our ciders. And we don't pitch any yeast and use any sulfites, so we're interested to see how that sort of thing might more simulate the type of cider that you get from 100% wild foraged, often the pucker brush type of cider. So that's what we're up to, and it's working out so far so good in terms of the benefits that you look for from integrating livestock in that situation, which is mostly keeping the vegetation and undergrowth down, but also has some really great pest control benefits, which we're reaping the benefits of now. So yeah, that's a little bit about it.
Excellent. I'm curious if there's anybody else on this call who's doing anything with silvopasture, any keeping animals in your orchards, or using fruit or nuts that you've foraged to feed your animals.
I used pigs extensively when I was breaking in our orchard ground initially, and this was a paddock rotation plan that just worked really well to open up sod and fertilize. So I think they certainly have their place perhaps at all phases of orchard development. I'm really excited to hear about Eliza's fruit harvester, because that would allow fruit to drop and not plop into a pile of beep.
Totally. It's so amazing not to have shit covered fruit.
Quite the invention. So good. And now there's a sort of a conversation taking place in the chat about mapping fruit that you found, GPS, notebooks, naming, etc. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Sure, I'll speak to it. I mean, I asked the question, but
Thanks, Sean.
yeah, no problem. This is the former school teacher. in
Is
me.
this the other Sean? What are you doing?
Yeah. That was my cousin. So the reason I ask is I guess I'm thinking more about people who might not be that familiar with how to start and keep track of things. Part of what actually got me into foraging was talking, if any of you know in Maine, David Buchanan, who I work with, had no system. So part of what got me excited was trying to figure out a system for cataloging stuff. But it does seem like there's stuff available. Eliza, I would love for you to speak a little bit more to what 3 words. I use a system called EpiCollect, which is an app on your phone that is meant for biology experiments. But I'm also particularly interested in how people name their fruit that they find, because I think that's very interesting in terms of if you're trying to give things a precise identity and personality, or if it's totally functional, or if it's between the two. I would just be curious. I tend to kind of go slightly with location, and then also some type of occasionally a story of some kind if there's a story that led to the fruit. But I'd be curious to see where other people are on that.
Yeah, so I use a program called What 3 Words. It's both an app and it's a desktop program that you can visit right now if you want. But it's great because like one of my major lat-long coordinates are really hard to make sure you get right in terms of cutting and pasting, and I'm always messing it up, and Google freaks out about them sometimes. And so like I've used Google like Maps for a long time, but then a colleague of mine was like, check out What 3 Words. And so you basically, everything is broken out into quadrants, into small quadrants that are broken up in your on your landscape. And so like it'll get you let it know where you are, and it'll be like, okay, you're in cider, flip, address. And those are your 3 words that give you the exact location of where you are within like, a house is the size of a house basically. And so that's really helped me, at least. I mean, I keep notes as well, but you can favorite, you can edit where that, what's there and all sorts of stuff like that. But it's way easier for me. I guess I'm more of a word person instead of a numbers person. So it's way easier for me to deal with that rather than coordinates or a wonky app, like wonky Google Maps or something like that, or a GPS. GPSs are still not that easy for me to navigate, and you have to have another thing on you. So.
Right. Well, that's a really great tip for being able to keep track of where you found things.
Laura,
Matt, I'm curious. Did you? Oh,
Can
go
I just
ahead, Todd.
Yeah, can I just say one thing really quick about that? John and Laura and I were just talking about this the other day, because I think why you're keeping track of the fruit seems to me really important. And for us, I think one of the things that's challenging, we were just talking about names because people want to know what it is, what this tree is in the Maine Heritage Orchard. And it's really challenging to capture all the information that you need to create a sort of pedigree for that tree so that it gets, so I think it's really, one comment I would make is I think that for example, each person probably has systems, but also then making sure, obviously, like Eliza was saying, that you can get back to a specific tree. And we have so many relict orchards that is actually our biggest challenge. Like Google Maps works fine if there's only one tree. You can find the one apple tree. But once you're into orchard settings, that's the most complex. And again, in general, I'm not keeping track of seedlings, so that makes it easier as well, because we're in where there are multiple trees, we're really focused on the older trees.
Yeah, definitely a good point. And this is switching gears a little bit, but back to the names of varieties. I was interested, Matt and William, did you find that there were any sort of like common themes that came up from last year's pomological exhibit, putting together that book? Did you notice any like themes of how people were naming things, or names that were particularly useful or not useful?
I felt like, I mean, yeah, I sometimes feel like the names tell more about the people that found them. But usually the best names are like a mix of that. Like it's a mix of the character of the person that found it, but also the apple itself. So, like one of my favorite apples from the exhibit was Hospital Orb. And I just feel like, it's like all great apple names. It's like extremely intriguing, but it's also so practical. So I mean, I don't know really anything personal about the individual that submitted that apple, but I always forget their name. But along with a few other apples that they submitted, they seem like a very practical person. But also, that apple specifically, it is really beautiful and kind of has like a glow to it. So probably looks specifically like some sort of like orb in the tree. So I don't know. I feel like usually it's like, yeah, some sort of characteristic of the way it looks, or maybe the way it tastes, but also like there's like a little sprinkling of that person's personality usually, which I personally love, because it speaks to like the relationship between like apples and humans, and just like, the tree has fruited and produced something to catch the attention of land dwellers to consume and spread more seed. So like acknowledgement of that relationship and that like attraction is interesting to me. Matt, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a great question. I'm actually just sort of working on, I've just outlined sort of over the past couple of days an essay, or like a little writing piece that I want to work on about apple naming as it relates to seedlings and fruit exploring, because I think it's just so much of the human culture within our interest with these fruit crops has to do with the names that you ascribe to them, because that's all really the human theatrics of the passion rather than anything else. But it's something really pleasant and wonderful nonetheless. And there's like in this book, there's like categories that I would say people's apple names fall into. And like Sean was saying before, some of them are more locational or have to do with like a memorialism of some sort to the person or the type of property that it's on. Obviously Winthrop Greening, of course, is like a very straightforward locational kind of name. But in the book, and I think as really reflective of the cultural, like the current state of fruit exploring culture, and especially with apples, due to the just crazy like diversity, and we're getting a lot of this like linguistic oddity and like dialectical like shenanigans going on now, where I don't know, one that I really liked that I heard recently was from Fabio at Westwind Orchard, where he has this really bitter apple that he calls, you might taste it and call it a spitter, but he calls it Westwind. His name is his farm is Westwind Orchard, and he calls the apple Westwind Spitter, like SBITTER, as like spitter, but it's a bitter spitter. And this kind of like pun thing that we all love. And of course, like the screenshot thing, I don't know how you feel about that in the main crowd, but I think it's amazing to think of it as like there can be this literal locational thing where it's just off the wall. Like we had one in the exhibition called Porcupine Wine, which I liked a lot. Like it's a good cider apple, good cider sharp, but like it's up high in the woods where the porcupines will be feasting on it. So there's this like funny unrefined and sometimes very refined humor to it. So I kind of tend in that creative sense, but it's all very useful to think of it in different categories based on who is the fruit explorer and where it comes from.
Yeah, Matt, you come up with good names.
Thanks.
Juicy, juicy pineapple.
Oh, the juicy, juicy pineapple, such a good one. Yeah.
My favorite name of all time is Juicy Hog Biscuit. So, yeah, just got to be there.
I love that one.
I brought some apples that I recently named, and so I really just want to get feedback on if these names work. So this is called Runner's Fortune because a runner came by while I was harvesting this tree and told me about this tree in Bodenham, Maine. So I feel like I know there's like Laxton's Fortune and Laxton's Laxton. All the Laxton names are silly noun names like fortune. So this is Runner's Fortune.
Dude, how much crowning is on that?
That
looks like a delicious feeling.
It's crazy. It was along the Cathans River in Maine and has, it's a silly shade. It's very silly. This is Cathans Russet. It's a russet on Cathans Road. This is Scarborough Strawbanna because it's from Scarborough, which if you've ever been to Scarborough, Maine, not a lot of apple trees. It's mostly residential. This is an industrial park next to Maine Karting, and it tastes like a combination of strawberry and banana. So Scarborough Strawbanna.
I like that.
Last one, this one's less exciting. This is Great Neck Sweeting. It's on Great Neck Road, and it's sweet. Matt, does this work? Like, does this system work, do you think? Is this like, am I in the vein of how you're supposed to name these things, or am I off on I mean, Eliza's Biscuits one is just ridiculous. That's amazing. So
the beauty of apple naming is there are no real rules. It's referential to the fruit explorer and whoever is interested. So I think those are awesome names. I wish we had Angus from Rocky Ground here because some of his names just like you have a heart attack laughing so hard at some of these, but you know, those are great names. I especially like the Scarborough Strawbanna one.
Yeah, coming to a grocery store near you. This guy right here. Scarborough Strawbanna. Honeycrisp better be on the lookout.
They'd probably be like smoothie or something because it sounds like a smoothie. That would be like a club apple name.
It could definitely be patented, become a club apple.
Sticker now.
Yeah, good to remember that Matt Kaminsky is the authority on apple naming. So run them all by him.
Well, to that point, I found an apple earlier this year that I think is a Jersey, but I almost felt incredibly self-conscious about naming it a Jersey because I was like, is Matt going to come after me if it's not like sufficiently Jersey-like in its form? And I decided to tentatively name that with an asterisk, pending his approval.
That might be the most confusing suffix for me, and I'm sure a lot of others. That one just because we have a variety in our orchard, White Jersey, and it is probably the most variable in shape variety that I have ever dealt with. We get these like oblate, like saucer looking things, and then something that more resembles like a black gillyflower because it's so long and conic. So to tell the truth, it's all out the window for me when it comes to Jersey. Other than that, I know it confuses a lot of people. Maybe somebody else can weigh in on what the proper submission process for naming an apple Jersey should look like. Maybe that's Sean.
I read a funny book that said, I think someday, yes, but I think there's enough, Matt. I think we can get there someday. We should work on it.
Yes, I think always sticking to adding some sort of locational clue is useful, at least for yourselves to go back and find the tree again. And there also, I was wondering if we want to follow up on asking deer hunters and mushroom hunters about old apples. But first, if anybody, maybe Sean or Matt would like to start with sharing advice on earning a living from fruit exploring, such as foraging fruit for a cider maker. Or Eliza, you've also sort of turned your fruit exploring into a career. If any of you want to jump in.
I think how Eliza described it was a lot more viable than anything I do. I sometimes feel like a big wet blanket, but occasionally I do classes with a wine and cider shop in Biddeford, Maine. And oftentimes it involves people asking me about the viability of, in Maine, I mean, it's interesting hearing Matt talk about sharps and his pursuit of sharp fruit, partially because one of the biggest issues in Maine for cider makers is a lack of cider fruit. There are not established orchards growing fruit for cider. So it makes you a lot more reliant on foraging in a way that sounds like it should be profitable. But I think, as everyone probably experiences in foraging as time goes on with climate change happening, it's just not a reliable. I think what sounds to me like a good plan is something far more wide ranging than a particular fruit or a particular nut. And just if you are in fact foraging for multiple different people, multiple different needs, that likely makes sense. But it's certainly not something financially, for example, in Maine, which is kind of, I think, telling, because there are a lot of apples in Maine. So if there was a place that you could maybe turn it into something more commercial, it would be here for apples. But I think it's tough. It's really tough. I think it's really about finding the right people who have a use, and explain to them what that use might be. And so for this year, for example, a friend of mine and I coordinated an event with local chefs around cooking with apples for the last 4 days, actually, just started on Thursday. And, most people wouldn't touch seedling fruit for that. But I think if you got them seedling fruit and put it in their hands and showed them it could be great in the kitchen, then they would be all about it. So I think it's a lot about that education piece. And there's always going to be a certain hesitancy. I mean, obviously mushrooms is something that people come around to accepting, but I think there will just naturally be a level of caution that you have to explain and help people through. And then I think that could provide opportunities to get fruit into people's hands that would be economically viable for you as a forager, but also economically viable for them in terms of selling whatever they make out of it.
I can chime in on this a little bit more. So like I went with my business partner, Taylor Malone, who also, we both are on the board of the North American Fruit Explorers, and we started a business called The Fruit Explorers. It's all about your lens. If you want to make a go at this, like what Sean is saying, if you want to make a go at this one, like if you're just if you're banking like you got to figure out your income, number one, like how much do you need to live? But two is like, if you're going to bank half your income on the fall, like one, you need to be prepared for efficient harvesting or else you're going to get burned out. I know several people who have been hired by cideries to just go hog wild, harvesting as many cider fruits as they can. And like, they can't stand it by November. And also I think they feel a little used by November as well. And so it's really important, I think, in my mind, it's important often, at least if you don't have an equity stake in what's being created, to be your own business and be a contractor and sell that fruit, so that they're paying for the price of this fruit, because this isn't filler fruit that you're offering. Like, this is the fruit that makes your cider taste good. And that's how I often market it, is like, sure, you got a whole orchard full of Gold Rush and Honeycrisp. Let me tell you why your cider sucks, and let me tell you how to make it better. And so, yeah, that's something that's very important to me. is one, I know where my finances are, and I know I can fill through the fall, but also like I've got a lot of lenses going on. So I've got a silvopasture lens. I've got a restaurant lens, you know, and it's making those relationships happen where you can call up a restaurant and be like, dude, I have the most amazing bittersweet that you need to try and you need to incorporate somehow, because people aren't going to try, they're not going to have access to this, and you got to hype it. So, but also you got to be able to harvest it quickly. And so you're not killing yourself and you're not spending half your day bent over. So those are my thoughts on going full time. And also I will say that I do, as part of the Fruit Explorers, like Taylor and I do a lot of sourcing work for hire, but also we do a lot of like database work in terms of finding information, finding that background story, creating the story for these people to use, so that it does become a value-added product.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering if Jesse, Aaron, and Jacob, if any of you want to chime in, sort of on the other end of things, instead of selling the fruit, selling the trees, propagating maybe some of the finds that you have come across, and how does your nursery business, any of them, how does that work for you?
I can talk to that in terms of the nut exploring that I've been doing. So looking for just nut trees, outstanding specimens in terms of size or productivity around me are a tremendous resource in the nursery. And one good drop of nuts from a tree can yield thousands of dollars of nursery stock in a year and a half. So in that sense, yes, the fruit and or nut exploring is definitely an integral part of my livelihood as a nurseryman, because I'm out there providing my own seed, and in some cases also scion wood from historic varieties. So in these cases, the actual poundage of, say, chestnuts I can harvest is a drop in the bucket with the potential value of those being used as seed. And furthermore, just having the documentation that, yes, chestnuts, for example, can be grown successfully in Maine is just that kind of background information that is and documentation of the viability of these crops that I just find so useful when it comes to recommending species to other people to try out.
I would second that as well, and say I would also add that locally proven genetics and a local story can be a huge selling point for nursery stock. So just to be able to tell people like, yeah, this tree was bearing well in our region. It's been there for 50 years. It's been there for 100 years. Or to just have an interesting story about how the parent tree originally got there. Definitely makes people more excited to plant those trees.
Getting back to the cider fruit and trying to prop local cider fruit finds, I'm sure you guys know a lot of John's trees, like the Screenshot and Fuel Service and some of those, but we've been reaching out to other local cider makers. Like I have a bunch of trees in my nursery from Gene Cartwright from back, his called Kane, and reached out to Angus and talked to Matt his. So we're always trying to start propagating some of the good local cider fruit finds and see how they'll do in a more cultivated orchard setting. So everyone has recommendations like that in the coming years. Fedco is excited to propagate that stuff.
Great. Is there any more to be said on the collaborating with hunters, hunters of maybe deer, mushrooms, other treasure hunters, for tips on old apple trees.
Gee, one
Or
resource I've thought of has been not mentioned would be arborists, because these are often the folks that are interfacing directly with homeowners and landowners, and also take an interest in trees. And I have kind of fantasized about, taking a day and just like calling every arborist in the state of Maine and saying, hey, any big old pear trees in your neck of the woods? I'm a fruit historian. So I would say anyone who's interested in trees and walking around could be a potential resource. So by all means, but not all of them, of course, are listed in the phone book, and that's why I think arborists could be a big one to reach out to. And I have in fact gotten some leads from local arborists that have been valuable for me. So I would say check out arborists.
I would also say, as I said by example, runners. These crazy people who go all over the place. And this guy was crazy. He actually, when I was picking the russet, he said, oh, is that a pound grease? And I'm like, who are you? Like, this guy just came out of nowhere and then told me that this tree was a bittersweet. So I guess well-trained runners, you should just train the runners in your area to identify cider fruit and then find them for you.
Yeah, I think that should be easy to do. We could all find a runner to.
Also, like, go to McDonald's at like 6 a.m. and if you see, like, if you can stomach the old boys club, like, for real, go ask them. The guys that are drinking coffee at McDonald's or Burger King or one of those places at 6 a.m. They know where all the trees are. So that's my little tip.
That is a good tip. I think that John Bunker used to say that he would occasionally go to meetings at like hunting clubs to ask about old apple trees. And Dan, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I am curious about how you found many of your old pear trees. There's lots to be seen from driving by, things you can see roadside, but there's also a lot hidden behind buildings up this way anyways, and in the woods, of course.
Yeah, a lot of the trees that I've found, I find them when I'm driving to work. I do carpentry on old buildings, so that kind of takes me all over the state, and I just do a lot of goosenecking and looking for pear trees. And I find that one of the best times of year to look is in the winter, early spring. They have a very interesting distinct sort of skeletal structure that really kind of stands out on the landscape. So I found a lot of trees that way, just driving around and not looking at the road.
Yes, nice. Well, I want to leave a few minutes here at the end for anybody to sort of plug upcoming events, webinars, also maybe any work that's being published that's coming out soon. So let's take these last 5 minutes and people can share about some upcoming fruit exploring projects. Okay, well, there is the University of Idaho is putting together a Heritage Orchard webinar series, which the next one is this coming Wednesday, where Cameron Peace will be talking about apple genetics and DNA testing, mapping the genetics of the Malus species. And that I think you can just find online if you look at the University of Idaho Heritage Orchard Conference. And we may have events coming
Sorry,
up.
I'll mention just briefly about that one.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll be specifically talking about using DNA profiling for identity and parentage. What I won't be talking about is the bigger picture, which I talked with you guys about at the Apple Camp last year, of all the pedigree, like how it all connects up into one big family tree. Well, that's my hypothesis anyway. But pulling it back down to really what we were talking about earlier, today's the identity of things, and then parentage is pretty cool. So adding that.
Very good. Well, I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully many of you will be on that call as well. Any other upcoming events? Exciting news to share?
I heard William is publishing a book in the next 12 months. Maybe he could speak more about that.
Yeah, so I have been working on a second Odd Apples book. The first one's been sold out for, I guess, almost 2 years now. Yeah, you know, we were gonna do it this year, and then there's just like a lot going on this year. So Andrea and I have decided that, you know, it's really best not to try and grab people's attention right now, away from things that are very important. So we are, it's primarily going to be like this kind of art book, but like essay thing hybrid. It's still taking shape. It's going to have photos, obviously, but it's also going to have contributions from people, like just kind of whatever they want about apples. Like I have a friend, Nina, who wrote like a lovely short piece on dyeing garments with apple leaves, which is really cool. And my friend Jenny wrote a funny, quirky piece about how to eat an apple. That is actually really great. John Bunker wrote a piece that is really great. Yeah. I don't know what else to say about it other than it's going to have probably most of the photos that you saw on Instagram, although probably minus photos that feature apples and bugs, because we did create some stylistic rules. Although there will be like fun behind the scenes stuff. I'm rambling because truthfully that's my nature. But it'll just have, yeah, it's going to be a celebration of apples. There'll be some seedlings in there. There'll be, you know, some classic cultivars in there. And I think we have over 100 cultivars featured in the book. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have any questions about it? I don't know if I'm the best person to describe it. We're hoping to, our goal is to finish we've selected most of the photos, of course. I've taken new ones already this season, so we'll have to reevaluate them. But we're hoping to finish everything by January to submit to a printer, or potentially work with a publisher or self-publish, and maybe raise some money so that we can print enough copies that it won't sell out so quickly this time and more people can get it, because economies of scale are really hard to do when you're just two people. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Liam. I'm excited to see it. I'm sure it's going to be excellent, as the first one was. Well, I think I will stop the recording, and if anybody else has anything to add, they can, or else we'll just sort of trickle away. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming. This is a really great way to spend a sunny, beautiful fall day. And I'm glad to connect with many of you and hear a little bit about what you've been up to this year. So thank you very much.
Good to see everybody.